So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest webinar from Eurostat. This webinar we're doing today is following yesterday's release of the 2023 Sustainable Development Goals Monitoring Report. And indeed, I think there's a lot there that we will have a very good discussion on today. I'm John Verinder. I work in Eurostat, and I'll be moderating the event today. We will be recording the event, so just please be aware of that. We will have an interactive opportunity using the tool Slido. Maybe you're familiar with it. It enables you to basically ask questions, which we will then deal with later on in the webinar as part of a panel discussion. Here on the screen, you can see the code for the Slido in case you want to go in and put a question or a comment. The code is #2837492, but there's also a link available on the Eurostat streaming page in case you want to go there. So that's in the way of the introduction to the webinar. We have a distinguished panel of speakers who will join us today. And indeed, we're going to kick off with Vivica Palm. Vivica works in Eurostat. She's the Director of Sectoral and Regional Statistics. So over to you, please, Vivica. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And I will also say that it's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to discuss this interesting report. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure also to welcome you to this online event on the monitoring report. And it was, as John said, published yesterday, so it's on our website. And since the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development by the United Nations in 2015, we as Eurostat has the mandate to monitor this progress towards these goals in an EU context. So that's why we are presenting 100 indicators, and they translate the global goals into the EU environment and context. So many of them also serve at the same time to monitor existing EU policies, as, for example, the European Pillar of Social Rights or the Energy Union, and they have clear and ambitious targets. So as an example, we monitored the target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% until 2030. And as well, we're monitoring how to increase the share of EU's agricultural land under organic farming to 25% by 2030. We also have targets on the social side, for example, to lift at least 15 million people out of poverty and to halve the gender employment gap, all to the goal of 2030. So in some cases, you will find that EU policies have a slightly different focus than the UN goals. For example, in the global context, when we talk about SDG number 2, there it's a focus on how to end hunger and malnutrition, while for the EU, the focus is more on sustainable agriculture production and the reduction of environmental impacts of agriculture. So out of the almost 300 indicators for the UN, we have focused a little bit more on those that are most pertinent for this part of the world. So in the selection of these indicators, we have consulted both the other services of the European Commission and non-governmental organizations that deal with social or environmental or developmental topics, as well as the national statistical institutes that serve with many of the underlying data, because it's important for us that we have something that's available for all the countries in the EU, and so that we can build time series and actually make sure that it's a harmonized picture that comes out. We will continue to develop the new and improved indicators, and each year we have a type of consultation where we go through and see how far we have come in this. So together with the seminar, we also have a communication package. So there is the main report, which includes then the in-depth analysis of the indicators. So there you can go to see the references to the EU policy documents, and you will also be able to understand more about where the indicators come from and where they are, how they are connected to the goals. We also have a communication package with a brochure with a midterm assessment, because this is now half time since the project started, so to say. Since 2015, we're halfway to 2030. And the EU is also doing a voluntary assessment that will be presented at the UN to say something about how this progress has been so far. We have an interactive digital publication, which offers a more playful way of exploring the indicators that we invite you to use, as well as a graphical interactive tool that shows progress towards the SDGs at country level, as well as the situation where you can compare your country to the EU. We'd have a dedicated section on the Eurostat website, which offer various visuals and also access to the indicator tables in case you want to download them and do your own things with them. And there is a number of articles where you can read about it called Statistics Explained. So since the Commission under President von der Leyen came into office, the SDGs have gained importance on the political level. And therefore, I'm very pleased that Commissioner Gentiloni, who is the Commissioner for Economic Affairs, and he's also responsible for Eurostat, will address us via video message and describe in more detail the political importance of the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vivica, for leading us in and giving us a very nice overview of where we are in terms of the information available. And as you mentioned in your presentation, we're going to hear now from Commissioner Gentiloni, who is the Commissioner for the Economy. Commissioner Gentiloni will join us with a video message. So we'll just play the video message now. Thank you very much.
It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the 2023 Eurostat SDG Monitoring Report. I'd like to thank Eurostat for the invaluable work they are doing in this context. This year, 2023, is a crucial year because it represents the halfway mark of the 2030 Agenda, which was adopted in 2015. We want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the EU, and through our example, encourage other countries around the world to follow. That is why we have decided to present our EU First voluntary review at the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July this year on the implementation of the 2030 Agenda in the European Union. This will put us in a stronger position ahead of the SDG Summit that will be held in September during the UN General Assembly week. The Eurostat SDG Monitoring Report, which was published yesterday, will be a central element of the package presented at the High-Level Political Forum. Since 2015, the EU has made progress towards most of the SDGs, despite the enormous challenges of the pandemic and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We have notably made significant progress towards many socio-economic goals, while more progress is needed for the SDGs that relate to the protection and sustainable use of natural resources. Ever since the current European Commission took office in 2019, the SDGs have been a fundamental part of our political program. We have launched deeply transformative initiatives such as the European Green Deal, the Climate Law, and the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. The SDGs have been progressively integrated into the European semester, our annual cycle of economic policy coordination. And since 2020, we have an annual sustainable growth surveys to factor in more fully the social and environmental dimensions, as well as the SDGs. The Eurostat SDG Monitoring Report is also published on the same day as the spring package of the European semester. And we have stayed the course even as we faced up the two major crises of the last few years. The Next Generation EU plan we adopted in response to the pandemic and the Repower EU plan we put forward after Russia's weaponization of energy are geared towards accelerating our shift to a more sustainable and inclusive economic model. To deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, we need reliable and objective data to monitor progress. And Eurostat is our reference point for high-quality data and statistics on Europe, which are collected in partnership with national statistical institutes and other national authorities in the EU member states. Identifying the most pressing sustainability challenges in order to advance in the right direction is our key aim, and it relies on the high-quality data Eurostat provides. Ladies and gentlemen, so I trust you will find the latest report stimulating, and I wish you a successful event and a lively discussion.
Well, we've just heard from Commissioner Gentiloni, who has given us a nice political overview of where we all fit in. Now we're going to dive a bit more into the detail. And so I'd like to welcome Christine Meyer to present to us the more detail about the monitoring report and the findings in it. Christine is the Deputy Head of Unit in Eurostat, dealing with environmental statistics and accounts and, of course, sustainable development. So over to you, Christine, please.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, thanks a lot to all of you for attending this webinar, and I'm very pleased to present our results. I have prepared a few slides so that it's easier for you to follow. And I would like to start with an overview on the first slide, because as Vibeke has already explained, we are not monitoring, so we are monitoring the SDG goals. We use them as a framework, but we have translated them in the EU context. So we have chosen, together with the policy DGs, so other services of the Commission, with the National Statistical Institutes, but also with civil society, we have chosen 100 indicators which are relevant in the EU context. And 2/3 of them are aligned with the UN SDG indicators, but they are more geared to our context, and we are also monitoring the targets which have been adopted by our policy level. Compared to the UN level, our indicators are all ready to use, so we only include them in the set if we have data, and they are reviewed annually. So if there are new policies, then we also choose, we choose new indicators. On the next slide, you can see the result of this year's assessment. I will go into more detail a bit later, but you can see already here that we are doing very well in some of the socioeconomic goals, whereas we still have to do more for environmental protection and biodiversity, things like that, so more on the nature side. So on the next slide, I show you the two best performing goals. So it's SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. And we are happy to see that the recovery after the pandemic continues, and we have reached record high employment rate of almost 75% in 2022. And we are also on target to reach the 2030 target of 78%. Which was adopted in the social pillar. The GDP per capita is also above pre-pandemic level. And also this good economic environment helps to improve the poverty situation. So we have seen considerable improvements in all poverty dimensions in the EU, but we still need to do more efforts to reach the target of lifting at least 15 million people out of poverty by 2030, which is another social pillar target. The next slide, you see that we are also making progress in gender equality, SDG 5. So the women's hourly earnings are catching up with those of men. The gender employment gap has narrowed since 2017, but we also need more progress to reach the target of having the gender employment gap. On the other hand, in the area of education, men are falling behind, which is so we are not. That's also one of the interpretations we do for the EU. It's not only that we want to see that women are advancing, but we want to have gender equality. And so so if men are falling behind, that's also then assessed as a negative development. On the other hand, the share of women in leadership positions is growing, both in business and in politics. Then on the next slide, another two goals where we are making good progress. So it's a bit, they're following the other three, which I just showed. So we do both within the countries, but then also between member states, as we do it at EU level. So the convergence of member states is increasing. And in general, we also managed to integrate better migrants in the labor market. And under quality education, we see some positive trends in the participation and training. So, for example, there are fewer earlier leavers from school. But on the other hand, we still see that the quality of education and training needs to be improved, and digital skills of adults also should become better. Next slide. Just quickly, another three goals where we are doing quite well, but I just want to stress that for SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, we are monitoring the situation in the EU. So it's not taking into account the global geopolitical situation, but Eurostat has the mandate to focus on the EU situation. SDG 3 obviously has been impacted by the COVID pandemic, so the years of healthy life stagnated recently and the avoidable mortality rate went up. On the other hand, we see positive trends with other causes of death, for example, work accidents or traffic accidents have gone down. And the SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, is also developing well, but the share of sustainable and environmental friendly modes of transport is not increasing, both for public transport, but also transport of goods. On the next slide, you can see the goals where the EU makes moderate progress. So that's SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, 11, sustainable cities and communities, 14, life below water, 2, zero hunger, 6, clean water and sanitation, and 7, affordable and clean energy. You can find all the details in our report, but we don't have the time now to go into detail. But then on the next slide, I will focus on some areas where we still need to do more progress. For example, SDG 13, climate action. The EU has reduced the greenhouse gas emissions by 30% compared to 1990, but on the other hand, we have adopted very ambitious targets. As you know, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030, and we are assessing whether we are on track to reach this target. And based on the past development, we are not yet on track. But as you know, it's one of the priorities of the Commission, and we have adopted already additional measures in the Fit for 55 package. And so we hope that the effects will become visible within the next years. Then the last available data for climate-related economic losses is 21. And you will also remember that we had huge floods in Belgium and Germany, and obviously that also had an impact on our assessment in this year's report. Then the last two goals, which I would like to mention in more detail, is SDG 15, life on land. There we have some positive developments, like the forest area and the terrestrial protected areas increased slightly. But on the other hand, we still see pressures on biodiversity, and we have to do more to reverse degradation of land and biodiversity. SDG 17 is about partnership for the goals. It's also a mixed picture. For example, imports from developing countries have grown. But on the other hand, official development assistance has fallen. I think Carlos will have newer figures, so maybe he has some more details on that later on. And public debt levels have increased because of the COVID pandemic and all the government aid which has been done during that time. Then now I give you a bit of background in the next slide, also how we come to our assessment. So for each indicator, we check whether, so the past 15 years and the past 5 years, and if there is a policy target, we check whether we are on track to reach the target. If there is no quantitative target, we analyze whether we are in the right direction to reach the target. On the next slide, I give you a quick overview. It's very small, but it's just for you to know there are 22 targets which we evaluate in our report. And we, as I said already, we only use those which have been adopted by the political level in other contexts. So it's not that we, as a statistical office, define targets for the EU. On the next slide, I show you an example. So for example, SDG 4, you see all the indicators which are used to assess this target. The little symbol on the left with the target shows that there is a political targets which we evaluate. And then you can see both the long-term assessment and the short-term assessment. So in this case, you see quite a lot of green arrows. So it's doing quite well. And then on the next slide, you can see that so we take all these indicators together and we come to a goal assessment, which is then shown here on a tachometer, and all of the goal assessments together are then presented in the overview report, which you have seen at the beginning. So we don't do composite indicator for all of them because we say there are 2 different topics, and so it's better to keep them at the goal level, so SDG level. But on the next slide, I wanted to show you an overview. So almost 3/4 of all assessed indicators show positive developments, long-term and short-term. But as I said, we think there are 2 different topics covered, so we don't want to show an overview assessment as such. Then one additional chapter we have in the report is shown on the next slide, because most of our indicators are annual, so it takes some time to reflect also short-term development. Sorry. And therefore, we have introduced since last year a separate chapter, and we show here the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the aftershocks of the pandemic. Well, you find there all different indicators, for example, inflation rate. I show here just a few examples. So, for example, the import of energy products. In 21, half of the energy demand was covered by imports in the EU, and Russia was the most important supplier of oil and natural gas. And in 22, their share fell from, so Russia's share in the imports fell from 26% to 13%. So this was the impact of the sanctions, and that we tried to get less dependent on Russia. Then on the next slide, I show you also the environmental impact, because the greenhouse gas emissions, which are included in the normal assessment, refer to 21. But we have also estimates of quarterly greenhouse gas emissions, which cover 22. And you see that obviously after the pandemic, they went up again, but we are still below pre-pandemic levels. So we are continuing the good trend to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But as I said, we have very ambitious targets, so we still have to do more. Then on the next slide, there is also one chapter on spillover effects. So spillover effects are the impact our consumption in the EU has on other countries. So for example, if we, if we consume products which are produced in China, how are they, so what is our global footprint linked to these products? And in this overview table, you see, we wanted to show it also in relation to the population, because otherwise it's a bit abstract. So the share of the EU population in the total population in 2020 was 5.7%. And for example, the CO2 footprint linked to our consumption was 9.3%. So you see that we have a higher share than our population, but the good news is that we reduced this footprint between 2015 and 2020 by 13%. So we are also, well, we still have a way to go, but there is already some good news. In our report, we have CO2 footprint, material footprint, land footprints, and then gross value added. So these are, for the moment, the indicators we have available in Eurostat, but because there is a growing demand from stakeholders, so we will hopefully continue to work more on this topic. On the last slide, I will just quickly mention the products. So this on the left side, you see our monitoring report where you find all the indicators and all the information. Then in the middle, that's the statistical annex to the voluntary review, which was mentioned by Commissioner Gentiloni. So we have only our contribution, basically we have summarized in a brochure, which is available on our website as well. And then on the right side, you see our dedicated section on the Eurostat website. There you find all the visualizations which were mentioned by Viveka, all additional breakdowns for all the indicators which are available. So there is a lot of information. And if you don't find it, just send us a message or leave a message on the website and we will help you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine. You've made a very thorough look through the data that we have, and very graphically nice as well in the presentation. So thank you for this. So we come to our final speaker for today. I'd like to introduce Carlos Berrozpe Garcia. Carlos is working in the European Commission's Director General for International Partnerships, and Carlos will help us to have a view on the EU external dimension of SDG implementation. Please go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you very much, John. And I wanted to really thank Eurostat for inviting me to complement on the external side. And this year, I was explained by the first intervention by Viveka Palman and the excellent video by Commissioner Gentiloni. He explained very well why we did the first EU voluntary review on SDGs. So since my Director General was a co-lead with the Secretary General of the EU voluntary review on SDGs, I will start my presentation maybe about complementing some aspects about this voluntary review before getting to the issue of how we are implementing the SDGs externally in close cooperation, I have to say, with Eurostat in both exercises. So the first thing is, what is a voluntary review? What is this name? When we started to negotiate the SDGs, there was discussion about creating mandatory reporting accountability. It was not so simple. Eventually, we ended up with this term, which seemed to us a bit weak when we accepted it. Voluntary review, what's this? But in the meantime, we have been extremely positively surprised by the traction it has had. Basically, the meaning is that each country does an internal exercise to look how it is implementing the SDGs. And that has a statistical aspect, a policy aspect, a stakeholder consultation aspect. So it's an occasion to re-energize at country level the SDG process and to go to the UN and present briefly at the high-level political forum in July what we are doing. And basically, nearly all countries in the world have done it. All European member states have done it, and most of them several times. There's about 5-6 countries who have not done it. One clear exception is the United States, but we hope that with the current administration it will be done. And just to tell you, they are in contact with us now to start to report their official development aid by SDGs, which was a gap they didn't have. And possibly this will be one of the things that were missing before taking this step. So we are hopeful they will follow. And basically, it's this collective exercise in which every year about 40 countries through rotation explain to the others what they are doing and become subject to questions. So it's a pretty successful process. Irrespective of the initial V of voluntary, which was a bit scary, it worked out extremely well. And it is the place to be in New York to explain what we're doing. So why are we doing this voluntary review? If I may say, I would say, first of all, I'm sorry if it shocks a bit, because we can, and let me explain this. It's not obvious you can do a voluntary review at the United Nations. But in the case of the EU, already in 2012, in Rio Plus 20 conference on sustainable development, even before the SDGs were negotiated, but where we agreed to create the high-level political forum and to start the process to the SDGs, we said we must be part of this. And we negotiated a United Nations General Assembly resolution in 2013 to say that we're full participants to this high-level political forum. And therefore, we are in a position to present ourselves together as Europeans, as a union, to show what we do. And so it's an opportunity we have that not other regions have. So it had to be done. It took some time within the Commission to realize exactly how to do this, etc. We started on the external side some years ago with the European Consensus on Development, which said we go every 4 years to do a report of what we do on the consensus, which is the SDGs, support to partner countries. And eventually the SecGen and the cabinet of the President von der Leyen decided, let's do a full voluntary national review as other countries, since we can. And the other reason is, I said, why we can also, because we should. Why do we should do this? Because there was a demand from Council, from Parliament, from stakeholders that we had not put completely our house in order in a visible and explicit manner. So preparing the voluntary review is an occasion to enhance coordination within the Commission, to see what we try to achieve, to see what we're doing. So in addition to the excellent work from Eurostat every year, this was an occasion to push every single service and DG to say, are we serious about the SDGs? And to give it a push. And the final reason, after I said that we can and we should, the reason is that we must do this voluntary review because of what was said by Commissioner Gentiloni, which is the current attack to multilateralism by the Russian aggression. We have an SDG summit in September. It takes place every 4 years. So we said we must absolutely show that the EU stands behind the SDGs on multilateralism. And this was the main message we wanted to give with this. So I will share in the chat because there has not been so far a big campaign of communication of the voluntary review because the communication masters decided that it will be done in New York in July when it is presented by several commissioners. And that's the moment to make the big communication exercise. So we have not created a big exercise so far, but I will share the link so you can see the document. It's a package of 5 documents. The main one is the voluntary review main report, let's say, like a communication that you may be familiar with. Basically, what it does is to show how the EU delivers through a whole of government approach, the added value of EU action, the need to working together towards the SDGs, and then it looks into the priorities of a von der Leyen Commission combined with the so-called 5 Ps of the 2030 Agenda, people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership, and shows what we're doing in these areas. And importantly, it has a looking ahead element saying a number of areas that we want to do in relation to the better regulation, which is how we make rules to make sure the SDGs are really taken further in this process, how we will do it in the budget, how we will engage with stakeholders with some existing platforms, how we will improve the indicator set with a clear call of what Christine said about the spillover effects as a strong demand for that, how we will take it further through Global Gateway externally, which is the strategy for sustainable connectivity and infrastructure, and to push inequalities externally in our partnerships. So this is the main messages I wanted to give on the voluntary review, and then I will complement with a brief PowerPoint. I hope I managed to do it, otherwise I know my colleagues in Eurostat will do. Very brief on what we do externally in international partnerships to push the SDGs and how we report ourselves, mostly on the quantitative side. So I will share the screen if somebody can affirm that it works, so I can keep on. Please let me know if you see my screen with the PowerPoint. Maybe John or Christine. Okay, so basically, after the SDGs were adopted, we said we have to show what we do on SDGs, and starting with how much of our aid, our official development assistance, goes to the SDGs. And when we're doing that, we started consistent with the OECD. We went to negotiate immediately to the OECD the idea of reporting official development aid. We started to say, okay, each project contributes to various SDGs. So we could track by looking at all our projects since 2019, all the projects where, let's say, SDG 1, poverty, or 5, gender equality, were marked, but knowing that we're marking several SDGs. So we knew from the beginning that this was extremely useful to know how much we give to each SDG, but we knew we would generate some double counting, because in fact, our official development aid is about 16 billion. And if you look at this, it's like several times, because, and it's normal, sustainable development contributes to various fronts. So a couple of years ago, we started to fine tune this in something that starts to be a best practice, very successfully in OECD and maybe the future standard, which is we mark among all the relevant SDGs, one as main SDG. And this allows that these main SDGs taken in isolation, we never double count, because there's always the amount of the project is the amount of the main SDG. So this means we start to have data that tell us the number of projects and the amounts that we mark SDG 1 on poverty as main SDG or as a non-main, so significant interlinked SDG. And we start to have this vision. And from last year, our annual report provides this slide, which is pretty innovative, that shows how much support we give to SDGs, SDG by SDG, what very few countries do because of the complexity of the multiple SDGs. And in this case, you can see the full column in any SDG is all the amounts where it was marked, singling out the ones where it was marked as main in dark, and in light, the cases where it was not the main, but it was still marked. And this is very interesting and gives us a lot of information, by the way, on interlinkages, like when SDG 1 is marked as main, which other SDGs are associated, etc., which is something we showed a lot in the voluntary review. And just to finish, I realize I'm overstepping. We are also aware of SDGs, not only on the funding, but on the substance. So we have a results framework that has like 40 top indicators. We have many more potential indicators at project level, but we have like 40 corporate indicators, and we try to show how they link to the SDG. So we try to make sure that the projects on agriculture or on energy tend to look at the similar things, so we can aggregate in a manner that relates to the SDGs. So I am available for further questions. I will put into the chat. Please bear with me. I have not been able to read the chat while I was speaking. I will have a look a bit later after the colleagues of Eurostat take first maybe some questions about it. I will put into the chat also the link to the main publication, which is the link where you can see the EU voluntary review and the documents, so you can look at it. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Carlos, for this very nice international overview of putting the SDG work in Europe in the global context, which is entirely appropriate and important for us, of course. So we've reached the end of the point where we've heard from the speakers, and now we have around 20 minutes to engage with our speakers to find the questions that some of you have been putting into Slido. I do encourage you to put questions into the Slido app, as we said earlier. We'll run through the questions which have been posted, some very interesting ones. We'll try to answer them. If we can't answer them on the spot, we'll come back in writing with answers to those questions. But I think we might do quite a good job. So the first question was, most of the SDGs don't have clear numerical universal targets to be used as a benchmark to assess progress. So how do you cope with that? How do we cope with that? Christine, perhaps you can take this one, please.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, as I said, if there is no target, we look at the annual growth rate. So we check for the last 5 years the growth rate of this indicator, and then we have defined some thresholds. So if it's more than 1%, it's significant progress. Between 0 and 1, it's moderate progress, and then and if it's going in the wrong direction, yeah, then it's a negative assessment. So there it's just the direction of the development, because we feel that it has often been requested that we define our targets, but it's not the task of a statistical office to define policy targets. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And as you rightly pointed out, it's all about positive progress in that case to make sure that things improve and move forward. The second question is rather specific. Any data available on the harmful use of alcohol trends within SDG 3? Christine, perhaps as well, you could take this one. Thank you.
Yes, so in our set, we don't have an indicator on alcohol use because we wanted to limit the monitoring set, so we have only 6 for each SDG, and we had to make a choice. So there's one indicator, for example, on smoking prevalence, but you find data on the Eurostat website about alcohol use. But yeah, as I said, we had to make a choice. But if you need some more analysis, then you can have a look there. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. The third question focuses on the analysis of spillovers that you mentioned, Christine, and asks, are the gross value added figures net of inflation? And I'll take that one. And I can say that the changes in prices that we see in the national accounts are not feeding through into the estimates of the physical volumes, notably of emissions. So there is an adjustment for prices. We can provide more information, of course, in writing after the webinar. Question 4 is a kind of big picture question, and it says, are some goals more priority? Do some goals have higher priority than others? Tricky question. I'll pass that to Vivica, please.
Thank you very much, John. So no, explicitly, this is the idea of the SDGs, that the 17 goals have the same priority. So there is enough of indicators and information to sort of be geared towards a lot of different actors in society. So I think one of the difference between what we've had before is that it's now so complex that many people feel engaged and want to be part of this process. So what we've seen is it's not only something that is being done on a policy level, but we also see a lot of interest from various NGOs, from businesses, from pension funds to try and get into this. And so there is a little bit for everyone. That's how I tend to see it. So it's not something that you can lean back and see, like, how will they fix these 10 things? But it's a surprising effort where there's been more interest, I think, from society in general. And so every indicator, every goal is there in its own right. And we've seen also for the crisis that have been with both COVID and the Ukraine crisis, that people have asked us, should we now redefine this system because of these big things that happened? But it has stood the tests, that the things that has been taken up as relevant are still relevant. So that's which is also, you know, a reason to not try and sort of put everything into one big index, but to really try and provide more of this broader view of where is society going and what are the important components. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivica, stressing the multi-dimensional nature of what we're looking at here, of course. Then we have two related questions, I believe. We have a question about what is being done to bridge the gap, which I'm assuming means what's going on if we're falling behind on a particular indicator. And there's another question that asks, given the current rates of progression, how many of the 17 goals can the EU complete by 2030? So these are two kind of, I believe, related questions. So perhaps, Christine, you could help us out here.
Yes, it's a big question, and I will try to answer at least partly. Well, as you've seen, our assessment shows that we are lagging behind on environmental goals, and that's why the von der Leyen Commission has adopted the European Green Deal and has set into place many policies under this umbrella, let's say. So obviously that's not the task of Eurostat, but of other services of the Commission, and therefore, well, I will name a few, but I hope, I mean, I will certainly miss many, but just to name a few, for example, the climate law has been adopted, and in order to reach these targets, we have proposed a Fit for 55 package, then the revision of the EU emissions trading system, the effort sharing regulation, which sets binding annual greenhouse gas targets, target emissions for emission targets for the member states. We have adopted also very ambitious targets for energy efficiency and renewable energy. And then also in order to address the problems on the natural capital, the EU has adopted the 2030 biodiversity strategy, the forest strategy for 2030, the EU soil strategy. So there are many policy proposals now there, and we have to implement them, and then we will hopefully see the results also in the statistical data. So this will then be visible in future versions of the report. Whether we are going to reach the targets, we are not doing this assessment. I mean, as I said, we look based on past data. We check whether we are on track to reach the target. But it's not the role of Eurostat to assess really whether we are going to reach that. Obviously, yeah, from the policy level, as Commissioner Gentiloni said, that's the aim to reach all of them, and we are monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine. I think we're doing very well in terms of the questions which continue to arrive. So please do post your questions. We've got some very interesting ones coming up. So I think the next question is looking at, is there any country in the world that implements SDGs as seriously as the EU? So perhaps I'll pass this one first to Vivica and then to Carlos, because I think you both have a perspective on this. So Vivica, please.
Thank you very much. So here, before I came to Eurostat 2 years ago, I was part of the SDG monitoring at UN level, talking with the statisticians there. So from that perspective, I've been able to talk with a lot of countries and see where they are, what they are doing. I think that the EU is special in the sense that it has been really decided to be taken into the European semester, which means that the EU is asking all the countries to make statements about how they are faring and using these numbers to be sure that it is being something that we're all reporting on and comparing. So in that sense, it's taken up at fairly high level. But I would also say that we've seen with a lot of other countries and regions that there is a lot of interest, and I was particularly struck by how the African countries sort of geared together and really made this a good way of trying to get statistics into the mainstream, and also to strengthen the measurement so that there is a lot more coming from them. And I think they really made a good case for working together in the regions. And we also saw some of the countries that at first didn't really seem to be all that interested, then suddenly come on very strong and really dive into the issue. So I don't think it's not easy always to know. And of course, it can also be that some countries, they look very strong for a while, then they swap, they have another government that is not so interested. So I think these things go up and down. But yeah, it's encouraging to see how the EU is really harmonizing this and asking everyone for input, and also trying to sort of put this connection between what happens in the economy and what happens with environmental and social issues. So I think that's something that is rather particular. The way they quantify the climate goals and try to arrive at them is one of these examples. Should I also talk about what happens after the? John, did I understand you right?
Well, perhaps, Vivica, let's move to Carlos to give a bit of a policy angle, and then we'll move on. So, Carlos, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, the question of whether others take so seriously assumes that we take it very seriously, so that's very kind. I have my own thoughts in the sense that the EU is great at doing the job, but is not so good at showing it. A lot of things we do on biodiversity, on climate, etc., are spot on what needs to be done for the SDGs, but we struggle to organize this in a manner that is well communicated to the public and who realizes that what we do is pushing the SDGs forward. And actually, that's why we have done the voluntary review, and that's part of a broader exercise of not only doing but showing, because there is a value in showing, which is to make people move, because SDGs are to make people move. And it's not only governments, it's people, it's citizens, it's organization, the private sector, etc. And in fact, when it says countries, I would say it's not only countries, it's also regions, municipalities, all actors who do this. So each of us plays a certain role where we have a certain added value on a specific field. If you ask me an area where the EU, not only the Commission, can I say, is leading concretely in the way to push the SDGs, I would say the way we reformed 2 years ago the Better Regulation Framework. Better Regulation is a sort of book for European officials to do legislation and to do before that impact assessments. And what was done was to say, now every legislation has to do in the impact assessment an assessment of the SDGs it can and should contribute to assess the synergies, the trade-offs. This has to be in the legislative proposal, etc. That, of course, is a bit of a decentralized governance, because then you rely on every official who's going to do a directive on energy, on transport, to take this seriously. But if this is taken thoroughly, and we had a meeting with the SecGen colleagues in charge of better regulation, and it seems so, this is really a big transformation to mainstream the SDGs inside the way we work. In other areas, we have to learn from others, including sometimes our own member states, who are advanced in a number of issues that we have to learn how to combine with the budget, how to work with stakeholders. Everybody has a lesson to teach, and that's the whole point about the voluntary national reviews and SDGs. It's about sharing and working together and try to work together. But I will step in on the number of questions about what happens after 2030, how many we achieve, how many we don't. What I'm going to say is a bit of outside the official line, but I think it's important to realize. I saw a question which I'm replying indirectly with the Millennium Development Goals, which were not reached. And the Millennium Development Goals not only were only for developing countries, but the target was usually to have a problem, to have hunger, to have this disease. The issue with the SDGs is that there has been a sort of big change in which we wanted them to be universal for all countries. But once you decide all countries, you cannot have the same quantitative target for Malawi and Norway. The consequence of this has not always been understood, is that the SDGs change the nature of what means a goal. A goal in the SDGs is something to make you move towards a transformation. Because at the end, the need to bring all countries together on something which was so difficult to compare implies that the SDGs, in effect, are human rights. They are achieved for all. This is what the SDGs are about. And that is extremely powerful, but it also carries, for those who like measurements, statistics, etc., of course, our colleagues in Eurostat, the drawback that it's less easy than, let's say, the Millennium Development Goals, which was about having for some countries an issue, which means that probably the SDGs will not be achieved in the sense of numerical terms, because we are talking about things like ending poverty, ending violence on women, things that are inspirational and transformational. The second thing I want to say, since I have the floor on this, let's see what is the impact on multilateralism of the current crisis, because it was very, very difficult to achieve consensus in 2015. We started in Rio +20 in 2012. It was great. We did an open working group of 2 years, 13, 14. We went to the summit in 15. There was a big momentum and a big push to be together. I am a bit concerned now to think about the post-2030. It may be that the SDGs have to continue because there's no consensus to move beyond. But that would not be so extraordinary because they have been designed to be in the long term. So sorry, I expanded a bit and cut across some of the questions. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Carlos. You brought together a number of questions there into your answer and synthesized them, which I think is very useful for our watchers. I'm aware that the time is marching on and running out. So perhaps we'll take one more question, which I think is a little bit related to the previous discussions. And I'll ask Christine to take this one. We have a kind of overall question, which is, are these statistics country by country? And I believe that that's a reference not just to the EU, where we have country data, but also more broadly. How does it look across the world, if we can say something, Christine, please?
Well, that's a very big question. I'll drill it down to the more statistical answer, because so for our EU indicators, we have data for all countries, and as Viveka said before, we also have available on our website a tool where you can see how the countries are doing, in which areas they are progressing, where they are lagging behind, where they stand in comparison to the EU average. So I think from a country point of view, it's very interesting to look at this and then also identify at the national level which are the priorities to be addressed. Outside the EU, there is obviously the reporting to the UN, and you find all the data on the UN website. We don't do a comparative analysis between EU and other regions. I don't know if Carlos has more information on that, but so yeah, it's just wanted to say that the data is available, but it's not part of our report.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. I mean, what I would suggest is that we follow up in writing on this and provide the necessary links to the UN data set so that colleagues and watchers can actually find it themselves. Well, I'm aware that we've had a very rich hour of webinar here, and we're reaching the end of the webinar. So perhaps I can just ask our speakers if they'd like to add anything else, please. No?
Maybe just...
please, Carlos, please go ahead.
One or two I can answer in one sentence about the proportion of gender. Gender is a cross-cutting concern, so it's very common that many projects have a gender aspect but are not fundamentally on gender. So, and then there are some specific projects where gender is the core of the project. So that explains a bit this proportion. But the Commission has strong commitments to enhance both aspects of gender in its, well, not the Commission, the EU instrument. That's one reply. And the other I wanted to say on Team Europe initiatives and Global Gateway, there is clearly a willingness to work so that they, in a manner that they contribute to SDGs. And as I said before, they show that. And in fact, if you look, when you look at the EU voluntary review, you will see how often the concept of Team Europe initiatives and SDGs comes through. And the idea at political level, certainly my commission and the president of the commission, is that what we do in these Team Europe initiatives externally and the Global Gateway strategy really can be seen as contributing to the SDGs, because it's a central element of our efforts. So I'm trying to reply in 2 sentences to some of the questions I see. Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos. You've done a very good job. So I'd like to just thank now all of the speakers who have joined us. So Vivica, Christine and Carlos, and also Commissioner Gentiloni with his video message. I think we've had a very good exchange. This is a fascinating subject and a very extremely important subject as well. We have a number of questions from the Slido that we didn't manage to get to in the time, but we will follow up with those in writing. So you should be able to see our answers and links and so on that we can offer you to help you. There's also in Slido a short poll asking for your feedback on the event, and we very much value your feedback as a way of improving these events for the future. And should you have any other questions which come to your mind afterwards, there is, of course, Eurostat's multilingual user support, which can actually help you on that as well outside Slido. So once again, thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you very much for watching. And I wish you all a good continuation of the day. Goodbye, everybody.